I remade Pokemon Black and White in the form of Octopath Traveler. You might be wondering where this came from. The sudden interest came to me while playing through the second Octopath game when it first released. I fell in love with the HD 2D style world and wanted to remake it but in a different style. And since everyone has been wanting a remake of Pokemon Black and White, myself included, it seemed like a good idea. Luckily, I already had some experience with Unity, however I didn't feel like I could accomplish everything I wanted using this game engine. And since this all took place during the Unity pricing change that many of the community disliked, I also decided to look into other options knowing that I would never get affected by the pricing change anyways. There was two main game engines that I immediately thought of. The first one that I considered switching into was Godot. I used it in the past for around a month, but I couldn't really get a handle on it and I didn't really feel like trying it over again. Then there was the second choice, and it just so happens that the creators of Octopath Traveler also use this game engine to create their game. I'm talking about Unreal Engine. Many of the criticisms that I saw about Unreal Engine is that it was too focused on making games seem like AAA, and it only supported 3D games, but I went into it with an open mind. Of course, booting up Unreal Engine for the first time made me feel very out of place and intimidated by everything I was looking at. I followed a tutorial I found on YouTube that gave a quick crash course over navigating the different menus, different features such as landscape and blueprints, as well as materials and texturing. After finishing the course, I was now a complete expert in Unreal Engine and was now ready to take on the challenge of recreating Pokemon, but I immediately ran into my first major hurdle. You see, I'm not an artist by any means, and one of the major appeals of Octopath is the sprites that fill up the world. This meant that I now had to learn the basics of pixel art and try to recreate some of the characters and textures from Pokemon in the form of Octopath Traveler. Since I needed a controllable character to start out with, I decided on the male model as I was too afraid to animate the female model's hair while doing the animations, but we'll come back to the animation shortly. After a lot of time of just looking over and examining the different characters of Octopath, I started creating the character model in A-Sprite, and honestly, I was proud of what I ended up with. But the problem is that this was one sprite out of many. Since Pokemon is originally a top-down game, I had to account for the different directions that the characters would be facing. Left and right would be simple since all it is a reflection, but the front and back would be trickier since I was confused on how to account for the lighting effect, but I think it turned out fine. Now it was time for the animations. There were 4 essential animations that I knew I had to create: an idle, walk, run, and a throw, which will be used in the battle scenes. I made a very simple idle animation with the character's eyes blinking as well as breathing in all 4 directions. I then started to create the walk and run animations, which took way longer than I would have liked. As for the throw animation, I only had to create one direction since I didn't expect to create a front and back version for the battles. Now that I had all the sprites, I needed to import them all to Unreal Engine. If you ever looked at the comparison between Unity and Unreal Engine, you would have probably heard that one of the main differences is their support for 2D and 3D games. And as a user of both of these game engines, this statement is true. However, this is only true for the base version of Unreal Engine. There's a free plugin that the Unreal Engine community uses for 2D games, which is PaperZD. While there are many uses for this plugin, the main feature is being able to create animation blueprint state machines, which allow for easy transitions between the animations when certain conditions are met. Now that all the sprites and animations were all properly created and imported, I created a simple player controller script and applied it to the character. If you were wondering if I use Unreal Engine C++ or Blueprint for this project, I used a combination of both, since there are many advantages to having the option of using both, mainly the organization feature. Anyways, now that I had the characters in the world, I wanted to focus on the environment. I wanted to create the starting town, which is Nuvema Town, as well as the first route into Accumula Town and at least one gym, but that's a future problem. For now, I wanted to focus on the textures. Pokemon Black and White is a 2D top-down game. However, since I was remaking in the format of Octopath Traveler, I wanted to create more than just a simple flat terrain. This means that besides the basic grass and dirt textures, I would also have to create some for mountains and cliffs. For each of these textures, I created a light and dark variant so I could easily blend between the two in the land. Looking at Nuvema Town, all the textures are symmetrical, minus the entrance to Route 1, but doing something like this in HD 2D wouldn't give the 3D type of look I was going for. So instead, I curved some of the paths so it stayed true to the original but not as streamlined. Unreal Engine's landscape features are very similar to the features of Unity's terrain, so it was very simple to adjust between them. Now that most of the landscape textures were created, there was just one more step, which was creating the actual 3D models. Just like my pixel art experience, I had practically no idea where to start with 3D modeling. I decided to use Blender since it seemed like everyone was using it to create these models. Looking back at Nuvema Town, I narrowed the list of models that I had to create. These included the 3 houses and the attached decorations like the bushes, mailbox, signpost, and lastly Professor Juniper's lab. Additionally, for the environments, I needed to create some trees, flowers, and grass for the wild Pokemon encounters. I started with a basic house, but there's not really a good side view of it. Luckily, the first 10 seconds of starting a new game shows an aerial view of the entire town, which is quite useful in looking for missing details. I finished creating the side view of the house and the textures, then imported everything to Unreal. Since this was the first time I created assets of my own, I had no idea how to correctly set up the materials. After a very long time of trial and error, all the materials were correctly set up and could be applied to the houses. I basically did the same thing for every other prop. Now for the environmental props. Originally I had a stylized type of tree and flower that I created by following another tutorial. However, after importing and viewing it in game, it didn't really suit the style that I was looking for. Looking at Octopath Traveler trees, it seemed to use only a single sprite for them, so I deleted the current 3D model of the tree and drew a very simplistic type of pine tree in an A sprite and put it in Blender. I bent some of the edges and rotated them to give off a 3D type of effect. After doing the same to the flower, I imported both back into the project, and I think it suits it much better than the previous style. Now that all of the New Town and Route 1 assets were created, I made a quick mockup of the scene and added some post-processing. The main setting that I needed to adjust was depth of field, as within Octopath Traveler, it gives off an effect that there's a spotlight directed at all of the characters, with everything behind and in front looking blurred. I tinker around with the settings until I finally achieved a result that I think looks close enough. I did a quick run through of the scene and was finally ready to create the actual Pokemon. Doing some research, Unreal Engine has something called the Gameplay Ability System. The Gameplay Ability System is a framework for building attributes, abilities, and interactions that an actor can own and trigger. Basically the exact thing I'm looking for. I started off creating the stats for each Pokemon. Since Pokemon stats are determined by the level of the Pokemon is at, I created a data asset which stores all the important information of a Pokemon, such as the base stats, type, and name of the Pokemon. The Pokemon stats are then calculated using a formula that I took off of Bulbapedia. I decided against including the IVs and EVs, but I did include the additional boost from the Pokemon's nature. Since this wasn't an entire recreation of Pokemon Black and White, I created a Pokemon actor for the 3 starters, including the Pokemon from Route 1 and the first gym. If you were wondering how many Pokemon this included, it was only 8 Pokemon, minus all the evolutions for each of these. After attaching the stats that I previously created to the Pokemon itself, I switched over to the battle transitions. I wanted to add some animation effects instead of making it look static, but I didn't really have any idea how to go about it. Apparently, in Octopath Traveler, one of the main tools that they used in creating the game was the level sequencer. Doing some quick research made me come to the conclusion that it was sort of like a cinematic feature that can control the position of the camera and start events when something should be triggered. Before playing around with this, I needed an enemy trainer that the player can battle against. I created the rival sprite for Bianca, which in my opinion is definitely not my best work. Placed her in the world and created a dialogue system that when finished, transitions into a new scene where the actual battle takes place. Looking at how Pokemon Black and White does its animations, it focuses on the enemy trainer before closing back in on the player. So I recreated this in the new scene by playing around with the level sequencer, and got a somewhat decent result. After doing this, I did a quick drawing of the UI and set up the dialogue boxes, so that everything wouldn't be said by a narrative box. Now that everything was in place, I started working on the actual moves that the Pokemon can use. Focusing on the damaging moves first, I used gameplay abilities which allowed me to specify the move type, damage, and whether it was a physical or special attack. Depending on these modifiers, the move will calculate the amount of damage using the formula shown here based on whether it was effective, not effective, or neither. I also decided to include more level sequencers that can be triggered depending on when an attack happens. I added a small damage animation as well as a tackle animation for each attack and tested it out. The last thing I did was create a stat boosting and reducing moves such as Tail Whip and Workup, and created a particle effect when a stat is changed, and with that all the moves were finished. To finish up Route 1, I added random encounters and the abilities to use items such as potions and Pokeballs to actually catch the Pokemon, as long as it's a wild Pokemon. Now it was time to move on to the first gym. Since all the battle features and Pokemons were already created, all I had to focus on was the models that I would have to use. I began by creating a floor texture for each of the sections, as well as creating a simple wall texture for each room. There are also these pressure plates that unfold the curtains when selecting the correct type. For the last model, I created props such as lamps, tables, and chairs and set them all up. For the actual gym leader, there are supposed to be 3 of them, one to represent the 3 starter elements. I decided to only make Silent. I created the basic idle and throw sprites and gave him the Pokemon that he uses for the gym battle. I added the final touches like sound effects and battle music, and with that, New Town, Route 1, and the first gym leader was done. So with all that in mind, here's the final result. If you made it up to this point, I just want to say thanks for watching. I learned a lot over the past year, whether it was from pixel art, 3D modeling, or using Unreal Engine, and it was a ton of fun. Now sadly, I probably won't be able to release this as a demo, since I'll probably get sued if I do. But if you want to see more games recreated in this type of format, then let me know down in the comments below. And until then, I'll see you all later.